this is the context of what I'm going to say. I've written this book in which I suggest that we're moving into an era of magical thinking. That we had years of religious thinking, which gave way to scientific thinking, and we're now moving towards what I call magical thinking. Now, I argue that this is just the way things evolve, and it's happened in the past, it's happening now, it'll probably happen again in the future. But for some people, it's actually very threatening. See, one of the characteristics of magical thinking that I describe is that it puts not so much emphasis on whether something is true as to whether it works, is effective. So, for example, the many people who go to astrologers, tarot readers, diviners to find out advice on their lives, what percentage of them go in order to get definite proof that the tarot works, it is true? And I think probably a very small percentage of them do that. The bulk of people go because they want useful advice about their lives. They want some inspiration, they want some help. They're more interested in whether the tarot gives them good readings than whether there is literal truth in the idea that it's got the ancient wisdom of the Egyptians in it or whatever. Now that emphasis away from truth is pretty formidable and a bit scary to people brought up in religious or scientific education or culture, where truth is very fundamentally important. Now I know that the religious and the scientific cultures have different criteria for judging truth. For religious culture, it's more to do with authority. Does this fit the word of the scriptures or the pope or the priest or some authoritative person? Whereas in science, the truth is more about does it make sense in the scientific worldview, and is there solid experimental evidence to back it up? So the criteria are different, but both think it's very important that you should begin with something as true. And so the idea of we're moving into a time when people aren't too bothered about truth is actually a bit scary. There's a feeling they're slipping back into something primitive. They're not asking questions in their way. Now, actually, in the magical culture, people do ask questions. It's a different sort of question. If someone makes a statement, it isn't so much, is that statement true, as why did they make it? What was its purpose, its objective? What was it trying to achieve? So, for example, take a magical text, something like, the Emerald, Hermes Trismegistus, the Emerald Tablet, has this statement at the beginning, which is variously quoted as above, so below, in various different versions of that. So, you look up and you see the blue African sky, you look down, you see a tiled floor, and you know it's rubbish. It just isn't true, is it? So, do we throw away the Emerald Tablet and try some other book? Not if you're a magical thinker. You ask yourself, why did they put that in? And you start thinking hard about it. Above, below suggests a hierarchy. Is this actually saying something about human hierarchy, that prince or pauper, they both are basically the same within? And then that sets you on a whole train of thought down that way. Or is it the higher mind versus the physical body? Can we learn about the one from the other? And so on. Now basically what's happening there is, and I've illustrated with that famous parable from the Bible of the very rich man who on his deathbed tells his family that he's left them a fortune and he's left it in his vineyard. And so the greedy family, when he dies, they rush to the vineyard and start digging and digging and digging, and they turn over every square inch of soil and they don't find any money. They're furious, angry, no buried treasure. But come autumn, they get an absolutely bumper harvest of grapes, and they make a fortune. That's very much what that sort of magical writing is about, magical practice. In my earliest writing, I used the expression, incoherent wisdom. And the idea roughly was this, that if the world is risen out of chaos, and a statement which is logical, rational, has got limited information in it, because this sentence follows on that sentence, follows on that sentence. Whereas a random statement, it's got a lot of random uncertainties in it, is full of information because you can't predict one to the next and everything. That's taking it a bit far, but basically, the more chaotic a statement is, the more potential work you can do on it, and the more potentially you can learn from it by studying and asking, why was that said? So, someone in magical culture doesn't feel that they're sliding back into gullibility and this, that, and the other. They feel actually they're on a path of self-improvement. So what does this mean in terms of, if we are going that way, what will it mean in terms of our society? Well, I'll take an example closer to now. I explain in the book why advertising and marketing is basically magical thinking, magical practice. So take an example of a slogan that was around for most of the early part of my life. Guinness is good for you. Now, is that true or is it not true? Well, we'll come back to that. But if you instead say, why are they saying that? Well, a lot of people living in inner cities are aware of Friday nights when people get their pay and the streets are rolling with drunken people who've had too much beer and puking in the gutters, things like that. It's not a very happy sight. And here are people trying to sell us beer. So what they must do is they must try to get a wholesome feeling in it. Guinness is good for you. Okay, now you can't, magic depends on something which is believable. Now, that's not quite the same as true. It's got to feel right. Well, you see, Guinness, a beer, compared with a lot of the things that are produced, mass-produced foods, comes from very wholesome ingredients. Fresh water, malted barley, hops. There isn't over much processing in that. So it isn't too big a step of the imagination to think that this actually is a pretty wholesome substance you've got here. And what's more, if you taste it, it's a little bit bitter. It's a bit medicinal. So it isn't too hard to go along with this game that this is good for me. You have a glass of Guinness, it feels great. Actually, it was good for me because I inherited in my youth some Guinness shares. So it was literally good for me. Anyway. Now, the funny thing is that as the truth people came in on it, after a while, I can't remember what date it was, Guinness was told you can't continue that advertisement unless you can prove to sort of scientifically acceptable standards that it really is good for you, and they couldn't. So, wicked magicians that they are, they changed their slogan from Guinness is good to you, they added an L and said Guinness isn't good for you. A statement that would lay outside provability. And in fact, in Britain, and I think quite a lot of countries, the little red L in a white square is a sign for the learner driver. And by putting in that L into the middle, they managed to build a campaign on the idea that anyone who wasn't drinking Guinness is a bit of a learner. You know, he's got a lot to learn. Clever. The point is that if instead of worrying whether this is true or not, or even accepting it must be true because they've said it, if you start asking why they're saying that, you're actually being offered a game plan. Is this a game you would like to go on along with? And if you quite like the taste of beer and you feel okay about having Guinness, yeah, it does feel good for you. You feel good for having one. It worked. Good bit of magic. But what about now, when people are getting really upset about politicians who simply tell lies blatantly? On the internet, they just fill Twitter accounts, things like that, with blatant falsehoods, and they seem to get away with it. What is happening here? How can magical thinking help in a case like that? Well, if a politician stands up and says everything that's wrong with our country is because of immigrants, they are taking our jobs, the country is going to the dogs, and we need to get rid of them. If you're living in a place like I am, where there's masses of immigrants and they are working hard, they're helping the economy to grow, they are interesting people, and they have different ideas, but they're prepared to share them, and it's very hard to get along with that sort of stuff. Basically, I'm being offered a game which I simply don't want to play. But what if I lived in a sort of downbeat, Rust Belt city which did have a big manufacturing base that has now gone to the dogs, factories have shut, whole streets of shops are boarded up, there's people out of work on the streets, there's rising crime. And then I hear that, the church down the road is being converted into a mosque. A what? A mosque? Here. Then the game that is being offered begins to be rather attractive. Now I see some people will say, well, that's proven it's true, isn't it? But we're not saying that. We're just saying the game this guy is, the game plan he has might work for this town. And so you might vote for that guy. And these things can work on a local scale. It is conceivable if you made it difficult to import foreign cars and you put a lot of money into this particular automotive industry, that it's possible the town might have a revival, the factories might start opening, the shops open, people feeling much happier. These things, are you just sort of bringing a dinosaur back to life? Well, it depends. This sort of success can have a momentum to it. It is conceivable that that town might become a centre of automotive excellence and bring in sort of forward-looking companies like Tesla might come in, and it might become a research space for new types of vehicle and new types of propulsion, and so on and so forth. It could become the sort of the Silicon Valley of the automotive industry. It's possible. Now, what if that happens? Those people who voted that guy in because they thought what he was saying was true will be absolutely sure now that they were right. It's been proven it's true. They're totally for him. But those people who voted in because they said, well, he's doing a bit of magic that I could go along with, let's see if it helps us, they're not so committed. You see, the trouble with truth as a defining thing is that it's binary. Something is true or not true. And so it tends to split society into those who believe and those who don't believe. In other words, that is what I call a religious society. Those who don't believe become heretics. They're cast out. They must be evil because they don't believe. So you don't actually bother arguing with them anymore. They're beyond the pale. You don't listen to what they're saying. Whereas if you're just balancing one game plan against another, you don't get into that polarized state. You're in a much more multi-dimensional space then. So we're now in a town which, thanks to this guy's policy, is becoming a really nice place to live in. Now, one of the things that happens is that when people are frightened, they tend to go to the right. They go for more right-wing solutions. Scared people do, and downtrodden people. But when people are prosperous and happy, they tend to move to the left. Now, some of those people in this town who may have supported that guy, they travel abroad and they find that their country is being despised. So they're not committed to the guy and his ideas, simply to a bit of magic he did. And they see that actually, although his magic worked very well in their town, it isn't working for the country as a whole. And they no longer support him. And politicians don't like that. They want that religious support of people who are totally on their side, my country right or wrong sort of support. So, what I'm saying is that if proper magical thinking becomes prevalent, whereas now most people are in that scared state where they're frightened, they're still saying, is it true, that's the only criteria they have. If they really start to learn to think magically, it may not be as bad as they fear. So what am I saying? Am I predicting that this post-truth era is going to turn out all right? No. What I'm doing is actually increasing uncertainty rather than reducing it with a prediction. What I'm saying is that when there's a big shift in culture, it's a mistake to make predictions based upon the previous culture. That at the start of the Industrial Revolution, probably a lot of people made predictions based on feudal society and its assumptions about what was going to happen. At the start of the Digital Revolution, I'm sure a lot of people made predictions about what the disaster was ahead of us based on the standards of the Industrial Revolution. And I think that it's very easy to jump to conclusions about about a post-truth magical world, which actually will not be how it works out. Because, as I explained, the magical thinking takes away that emphasis of truth, but it doesn't necessarily say there is no truth. It is not post-truth in that sense. Now, I know that there is the purist chaos magician who says nothing is true, everything is permitted. But that's not generally true of the whole magical fraternity. As I say, for most people, and I gave the example of the tarot readers, people who do divination, it's not the first thing is whether it's true or not. They're not saying it isn't true. They're just saying it's not what matters. It's how it works, what the effect is going to be and how it works out that matters. And so I offer that as some consolation if you're getting very worried about the things that have been predicted. What I'm saying is life is much less predictable than that. Let's see how it works out. And from the individual point of view, it could help if you really understand magical thinking and enter into this era doing it properly.